Okay, I'm John Limbert. I was in the Foreign Service for about 34, 35 years, served mostly in either the Middle East or Islamic Africa. During that time, I didn't see what you would call a lot of big successes. There was not a lot of saving the world, stopping a coup, averting a humanitarian disaster, stopping a war, and so forth, the kind of thing you might see Madam Secretary accomplish in her half-hour series. I was never really in that kind of position. In fact, perhaps the opposite. Trouble seemed to follow me where I went. I saw a lot of military mutinies. I saw a lot of coups. I served in Iraq. I served in Iran. I served in Sudan. None of which places were you would call a triumph for American diplomacy. But thinking about this, I want to tell a story from Iran in 1980. I had lived before I ever joined the Foreign Service, I had lived in Iran as a teacher, as a researcher. My wife was Iranian, is Iranian. And so I felt I knew the country fairly well. And I went there as a diplomat in August of 1979. That was about 6 months after the fall of the Shah. And as some may remember, it was also about 2.5 months before President Carter decided to admit the deposed Shah, and 2 weeks after that, a group of Iranian militants, young people, stormed the embassy. Well, that's where the story starts. At the time, we all thought this was something vaguely like a student sit-in, that this would last a day, it would last 48 hours, and that the adults in the room would eventually get together and straighten it all out. Well, one day became two became a week, became a month, and that was not going to happen. And I understood it was not going to happen about a month into these events, month and a half, when I received a care package from home with some clean underwear in it and some clean socks and some books. And the books included in the books were War and Peace, Brothers Karamazov, and Middlemarch. Well, you can see there was a message there. Average length about 1,000 pages. Someone was telling me something, that you're not going anywhere for a while. You're going to have time to do a lot of reading. I should say as a footnote, by the way, War and Peace is wonderful, magnificent. Brothers Karamazov is terrific. Middlemarch has to be the most boring book ever written in the English language. And I've since realized that many people share my view of Middlemarch. And even under those circumstances where you think you would be able to read anything, I couldn't read Middlemarch. I bogged down at about 200 pages into it and never got back to it. In any case, fast forward about 4 months to April of 1980. About somewhere around the 12th, 13th, 14th of April. And that morning we had a visit from two Swiss gentlemen, representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross, doing what they do, which is visiting prisoners. And in the afternoon, without any notice, an Iranian clergyman came in, and he was about my age, maybe a little bit older. I was 36, 37 at the time. Maybe he was 40 years old. And I was told that this man he was not an Ayatollah. He was a lower rank clergyman, but he was the Friday prayer leader of Tehran, which made him a major figure, and his name was Ali Khamenei. Well, of course, Ali Khamenei later on went on to be president of Iran and is currently the supreme leader. At that time, he was an influential person, but a lower-ranking cleric and a young cleric by the standards of the time. So he came into the room where I was in solitary confinement. I spent, of the 14 months there, I spent about 9 months of that in solitary. And I asked without really thinking about it, he and I entered a kind of interaction, Iranian interaction between host and guest. He was a guest in my space. I was the host, and therefore I have certain obligations as a host, and he had certain obligations as a guest. And we fell very easily into this pattern of interaction. So I insisted that he sit down. I excused the fact that I had nothing to offer him to eat or drink, because every host had to not do that as a host is a serious shortcoming. And we began to talk. And he asked me, do you have any problems? Is there anything that you are missing? And I said, sir, not really. I really have no complaints except one. And he looked at me and said, what is that? And he said, the complaint that we are here. And that is a problem. And he said, well, if the oppressive rulers of the world would wake up and come to an understanding, that problem would be solved. And I looked at him and I said, I thought to myself, I agree with you, but I think we have a different understanding of who the oppressive leaders of the world are. And then I said, there is one more thing. I said, Iranians are very hospitable people. A guest comes and they do not want the guest to leave. If a guest wants to leave, the Iranian host will say, oh no, it's too soon, you must stay longer. And they do, again, these are the ritual things that one says and does. But I said to him, this politeness, which the Iranians call ta'aruf, there's no real good translation of it, but this kind of interaction should have limits. It can be overdone. And I think in this case, our hosts here have overdone it. They have kept us beyond what is reasonable. And too much hospitality can be annoying. And he immediately knew what I was getting at. He is not a stupid person. Because, of course, what I was getting at my point was, what you have done, sir, is outrageous. What you have done is shameful. What you have done is disgraceful. And you have violated not only the tenets of international law, of religious law, of custom, but your own culture. Because what says in your culture that permits you to detain a guest against his will? And he understood this, but I did not rail at him. I did not belittle him. I did not use bad language with him, as tempting as it was. I simply said it in this way, and he understood it immediately. What I discovered later on was that that interview had been filmed by Iranian television. And it was shown on Iranian television. And people later said, when I came out in 1981, they said, we saw that interview, you really put it to him. They understood immediately what I was getting at. You never broke politeness, you never broke courtesy, but you made your point very clear that this was outrageous. The old Washington paper, the Evening Star, if any of you remember that, picked up the story. They had a good correspondent in Tehran and reflected the story, but I never thought much about it until the year 2009. So about 30, almost 1980, almost 30 years later, when the story resurfaced, and with a videotape now on the internet of this interview on, of all places, Ayatollah Khomeini's website. And to this day, whenever I go into an Iranian store here in Washington, whenever I meet Iranian friends, sometimes I'll travel abroad, and there might be some Iranians there. This happened, I think, at Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. People will say, "Oh, I remember you. You're the one who met with Khamenei and told him X, Y, and Z." And this is very much appreciated by Iranians, and instructors in Persian tell me they use this interview as an example of the mixture of the use of language and culture to make a very strong point. This was, as I say, a small triumph. It was not, I did not save the world, I did not solve the hostage crisis, but I think what I was able to do was to uphold the values of our service and our profession, which are that there are certain norms and rules of interaction, and to violate those, to go against those, violates thousands of years of rules of human interaction. So when I think about that story, I still get some satisfaction from it.